I'm Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketer with 20 years experience across the UK, United States and Asia Pacific. Last year I was fortunate to spend 3 months with Deloitte in Chicago. During that time I was really delighted to have the opportunity to spend time with a number of global experts. Throughout that period, I interviewed a range of leaders and shared their thought-provoking, relevant and influential takeaways weekly. Now that I'm back in Melbourne, the Katie Talks conversation with influencers continues. Today, I'm talking to Andy Evans, who is the CEO of Star of the South. Andy, welcome.
Hi Katie, how are you?
Really well, thank you. Excited to be having this conversation with you today.
I'm very excited that you invited me to speak with you. It's fantastic.
Perhaps you could just tell us briefly a little bit about the work that you do currently and a little bit about your background before we get into some questions.
Yeah, look, I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of the Star of the South wind farm, which is Australia's first proposed offshore wind farm. We're proposing to develop a site to generate 2,000 megawatts of electricity off the south coast of Gippsland.
And for people who are not particularly au fait with energy, we're hearing a lot more about it. Tell us what 2,000 megawatts, what will that power, just for the layperson to understand?
It's a lot of power. That's enough power for about 18% of Victoria's demand.
Awesome. Well, that's a very nice, easy statistic for us to get our heads around. And you've got a really interesting background which is quite varied. Perhaps you could just give us a little run through.
Yeah, look, going back, I suppose my career is about 20 years long. I started as a lawyer here in Melbourne and worked overseas in London for a few years, but always sort of grappled with being a little bit boxed in as a lawyer. So was continually looking for other ventures to get involved in. Like a lot of cliched lawyers at the age of 40, I decided I wanted to be a winemaker. So yeah, that was ambitious. So I took 8 weeks off and did vintage at a winery just outside of Melbourne. Did that. That was fantastically interesting work, but you really need another 20 years of experience to perfect that.
Yeah, sure.
So thankfully I've been working in the renewable energy space for about 10 years at that stage. And my 2 current partners at the moment started to look at some new projects, offshore wind being one of them, which was extremely ambitious 2012 when we started, and I would still say is very ambitious in 2019. But we've really managed to get some traction and attract large investment from Denmark, from a large infrastructure fund, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, and have been progressing the project with a lot of help from the Commonwealth and state governments as well. So it's very early, but we think there's a lot of future for it in Australia.
Oh, it's exciting, and I mean, there's so much going on the energy front. A lot of really good stuff with the push coming from the private sector rather than government. I mean, we could talk about that for hours, couldn't we?
Well, we could talk about it for days.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, how is your life and career improving as a result of being better connected with people across the globe?
I think it's essential. I think it's one of the standouts at the moment in this sort of age of electronic media and connections that way. I think being able to connect interpersonally with people, it's probably never been more relevant for progressing with things. I think the great thing I've found is that most people are so accessible to want to connect and talk with you, no matter what their backgrounds, no matter what their levels of seniority. So you look at the connections you can make now, they're no longer bound to your local state or area that you live in.
No.
In fact, most of my connections now, because the industry I'm in is a lot more developed in other areas, a lot of my key connections and now actually friends are based out of Europe and Asia in particular, and the US is a new sort of growing area for me. So look, I mean, I always encourage, particularly with younger people coming through, they're so savvy at connecting electronically, but a lot of those soft skills of actually speaking to people have diminished. And maybe I'm getting older, but now I'm 45. I mean, more people want to speak to you because you've got, different stories. It's no longer about what title you have.
Yes.
People are actually just really interested to hear from other people.
Yeah, they are. I, during my time in the States last year, connected with a lot of people I'd worked with for 5 or so years, and I knew their partners' names, I knew their kids' names, I knew their half marathon times, but we'd never actually met in person. But had these very quite deep relationships, and my kids, well, actually quite seriously sort of said to me a few times, "Mummy, are you sure it's safe to meet so-and-so, you've only met them online. And I guess I was pleased that some of those messages were sinking in.
Bit of stranger danger.
Yeah, totally. But you can just so comfortably and readily develop really deep relationships.
Yeah, look, and people generally want to catch up. I mean, you'd be the same. You get a lot of emails from people wanting to catch up for a coffee.
Yeah.
And look, unless you're really time prohibited, look, I love just going out and speaking to people, no matter what the age or background.
Well, I always learn something. It's always interesting, you know, occasionally can help somebody out or, it's great on a whole lot of fronts. So, Andy, you've had quite a varied career. What would you say has been the biggest turning point in your career?
Look, I think actually turning 40 and trying to be a winemaker, it actually got me to stop for a while and think about what I really enjoyed.
Okay.
And you're at a stage where I had a young daughter at that time, so I had to really weigh up financial realities, the fact that realistically I'm probably going to be working for another 15 to 20 years, and really look at what I enjoyed doing. So for me it was, look, there was one afternoon I sat in my office and looked at a wall of books and thought, I can't do this anymore. So I went and sat in the park for about 2 hours, felt guilty for about 30 minutes, but then felt great for the next 90 minutes thinking, okay, things need to change. So it was a bit of an internal well-up of wanting to try different things. I really struggle to sit still, even at the moment. So for me, I sort of got to that stage where I had a burning bundle of energy, but it was just being misplaced. So I had to stop for a little while to reorient, and it took me about 3 or 4 years. So, but it's sort of gradually going the right way.
I really like your openness, and I'm not sure quite that humility is exactly the right word, but it's close enough to talk about that, because I think a lot of people can, you know, having spent a lot of time getting themselves educated, and, you know, law degree takes a while, to sort of to be going down one path and then to sort of sit back and reassess is not something that everybody who is not happy in what they're doing has the guts to sit and do. What were there particular lessons you took?
Yeah, look, I think it was realistically not to worry about the external perceptions of what you're doing and what you think people think about you. Most people generally do want you to be happy.
Yes.
And I think they quite like that people are doing different things, because, look, it gets written about a lot. I think, you know, vulnerability is a real connector with people, because everybody else has got vulnerabilities. So to actually see someone else a bit vulnerable, look, in a way makes people feel better about their own vulnerabilities, but allows a reason for people to connect and work out some of their own, say, issues or some of their own uncertainties, and then look at doing things.
If you'd had your time again, would you have approached it differently, or are you sort of looking back and reflecting, happy with the way you navigated through it? Yeah,
look, I would have taken action earlier. That's probably the key thing for me. That was at about the age of, 40. So at about 35, I was always really clear that, look, being a lawyer didn't work for me, but we all have this internal view of how we should be perceived.
Yeah.
You know, I'd sort of come from a background, I was a good sportsman, had done well in law, things looked pretty laid out for me, and you sort of carry around those things. I probably did for about 5 years, where I knew that this wasn't the path I wanted to go down. So by delaying it for 5 years, I probably took another 2 or 3 years to then reorient. So you'd always like to say I wouldn't change things, because you can't, but look, I probably would have been more alert to wanting to reorient a little bit more and be a little bit more investigatory about other things I want to do.
Sure. Well, but it sounds like you're continuing some of that eagerness to look more broadly at what you're doing now. Yeah,
no, you do. Yeah. I'm just forever restless, so.
I like it. Andy, is there one thing that you would change about the business environment of today?
There's probably a number of things. I'd probably just get people talking a hell of a lot more. I find in the area that I'm in, particularly working with governments, there's a lot of shutdown, there's a lot of us and them generally. I think maybe I'm a real optimist, and the business that we've done, we've had to knock on every single door. So I think myself and my partners generally see things as opportunities, whereas I think a lot of people in business automatically see things as threats or risks. I think we've just got to break that down a little bit more. And look, you can start with your own group or wherever you work by talking a lot more, not only internally but externally. Just find out what people are doing. There are just so many assumptions made by people without actually getting to talk to people. And I find, particularly with a lot of our younger staff members coming through, there's a lot of desktop assumptions, and I'm like, how do you know that? Oh, well, I assume they're doing that. It's like, get out and speak to people.
Yeah.
So I think, look, business, I don't know whether it's government-driven in Australia, which has had probably a lack of certainty and optimism for a number of years, but I just don't think business approaches things optimistically. You can be foolish and over-trusting, but I think you've got to start from a point of wanting to do things together rather than looking at things as threats.
I like the term desktop assumption. I've heard of desktop research. I haven't heard of that before. I mean, I don't like what it describes, but I think it's quite apt.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people assume things and then shut down opportunities without actually speaking to people and understanding.
Yeah.
things.
Well, I mean, on that front, that makes me think about my decision last year, or so, what are we talking now, 18 months ago, that I really wanted to spend this time in the States last year to get my kids' US citizenship finalised. And I, having devised the plan on New Year's Eve, came into the office fresh in January, and in the first conversation, at the end of the first conversation with my manager, said, look, I've had this thought. I'm really confident I can make it work. Can we talk about this? And he was fantastic and said, yep, we can. You've got my support. I think it'd be a great opportunity. And what I learned from that was to take a completely unconstrained view as to what would make me happy, or what would be really purposeful and meaningful. And from there, yes, there were shed loads of obstacles, putting kids into school in a different country. There was a hell of a lot I had to work through, plus the 35-page form for each of their citizenships, which took a while, but got through it all. And that was just, it was just a means to an end. And I had a lot of people say to me, I can't believe you did that on your own. And it must have been so difficult. There must have been so much to organise, and there was. But because I'd taken this unconstrained view, as this, this would just be something fabulous. I just sort of started making lists and slowly ticked things off, and that's been a real learning for me.
Yeah, because look, there'd be a lot of people who just wouldn't ask that question in the workplace whether they can do things, and if you don't ask, you'll never know.
Well, exactly, and I like to be a bit audacious. It's interesting on both the professional and personal front. Professional in terms of pushing boundaries and doing new things, and over my 5.5 years at Deloitte, I've been really fortunate to work with partners who've had great appetite to go with that, and that's when the really magical, interesting stuff happens.
Yeah. So do you see a future for yourself at some stage in the States longer term?
Probably after kids have finished school. Yeah, I'd like to head back there to be near family. I also think a year or two working in New York is something awesome. I need to do. Yeah, it's close to family in Chicago, but it's just such a phenomenal city.
Yeah, New York is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm not convinced I could live there forever, but I think a year or two probably needs to happen at some point. Yeah, absolutely. Andy, what might people not know about you?
Oh, I'd say a lot of people wouldn't know me anyway, but look, I probably, from afar, I look like the standard stereotypical Australian private school educated person who played football and did law school, but look, I've probably got more of a thirst for trying new things than people may expect. Travel's not necessarily a new thing, but the winemaking is still something I'm really interested in doing. It's incredibly out of your comfort zone. I'd like to think I've got pretty broad views, but that for me was a real exposure to how exposed you can be. Look, created a wine label and then presented it to about 100 different people, and people actually look at you, think, I don't know if I like that label. I've had a few people, I made this beautiful Cabernet Franc. It was carbonic macerated, fantastic, but it had a little spritz. So then I had a lot of people having a go at me about my red wine being spritzy. So what I'm sort of learning is that I've probably got a greater desire to do different things. Certainly what I'm doing now, trying to develop an offshore wind farm, is a little bit moronic. I may have thought a few years ago, but it's sort of given me a bit of a taste to want to try different things. So look, there are a number of things I don't think I even know about myself at the moment. So I'm only 45, very young. But look, there are other little things. If I was writing this down in a magazine, look, I really like French films, which none of my friends really like. So I'm often sitting by myself, that sort of very sad-looking middle-aged white single male in a cinema. Not quite Lee Harvey Oswald, but you know,
good.
Yeah, no. so that's a newer thing, developing a bit more of the artistic or creative, or I hate to use the word cultured side, but that's probably a thing on first glance of people meeting me wouldn't probably expect.
No, interesting. Would you say that you learn more from success or failure?
Look, more from failure. Look, it sounds cliched saying that, but you do, because look, when you fail, you've got more reason to sort of assess things. I'm usually really good at moving on pretty quickly.
Okay.
But, you know, it's like the whole sort of hot oven. You sort of touch it, you learn, okay, I don't do that again.
Yeah.
I think from failure, you do assess things, and you've got an inbuilt mechanism that says, okay, I won't go down that path this time. I won't do that. With success, it's fantastic, because at least it sets the path of knowing what works. But of course, if you continue doing the same thing, you may be successful, but probably within realms that mightn't broaden your experiences or potential to look at new ways of doing things.
Are you good at, when you have failure or things don't go according to plan, are you good at dissecting them a little bit before you move on?
I'm developing it.
Okay.
I'm developing it. Just, I think, in the new areas that I'm in now, it's all new to me anyway. So what is success and what is failure? I'm still trying to work out what that is at the moment. Looking at our offshore wind business, look, we've had 4 years or 5 years of working with government. So some of the lonely nights you have at airports, I would look at as, geez, that was a real failure, but it was a real learning that's actually success, because I had the invite to go back a week or two later and no one shut the door. But it took me about 3 years to realise there were some really pivotal moments, which I thought may have been failures, but were a critical part of attaining success. And that goes back to that earlier conversation we were having around having lots of different conversations with people, and that never being a wasted opportunity, that it's always constructive. Would you say that we talked a bit about your pivot away from being a lawyer? So, as a reformed lawyer, would you say there are any significant challenges that you've navigated in your career that you've drawn particular strength from? Look, I've had strength. Probably my first 10 years of my career was marked by, I couldn't get past the magical 23-month mark. I had 3 jobs in a row which were 22 or 23 months.
Okay.
Finally got to my 4th job, I hit the 24-month mark, and it was sort of a nice little personal achievement, but it also sort of suggested to me that how I like to operate is based on a lot of change. A lot of people aren't great with change, and particularly being a lawyer, you're not good with change. You're good in thinking through things logically, and logic is about being committed to something, working out the evidence for, against, and making a decision on it. And I think a lot of the external perceptions are, if you're a lawyer, that you're measured, you're committed to something, and you keep going. But it took me a number of years to sort of realise that adapting to change and my need for change was probably my strength. It's really helped me out in current business now, wanting to look at new things but also try different things. So when one chapter ends, I'm never that confronted by having to change or do new things. So it took quite a while to sort of do that. And I don't think, as a lawyer, you're certainly ever fully reformed. And I think the thing that sort of disgruntles me is that people still, I haven't practiced in about 3 years, but people still refer to you as a lawyer. So every time you have a bad trait, whether it be at home or at work, you're so argumentative, you're such a lawyer. And it's like, no, I'm just really hot-headed at times. I fundamentally disagree with what you're saying. That's just an Andy trait, not a lawyer trait.
I'm sure that goes over a treat.
Yeah, it does. You're really well respected.
All right, I'll be sure to throw that into some conversation a little bit more, Andy. What does nirvana in your career look like? We've talked about this a little bit already.
Absolute unaccountability for me. The ability to come and go as you please.
Okay.
That's nirvana for me.
Okay.
I sort of find it, particularly, I like working in teams, but when I'm in teams, I'm a good team member, but I particularly like individuals in the group to have their own freedoms as well. I seek not to, you've always got to be accountable, and you've always got to, show that you're providing value. So it's never about that, but I like the ability to come and go as and when you please.
Sure.
I don't sit still in an office very well. I usually, with all new staff, have to make them aware that I'm not always here.
Yeah.
I'm always available, but I'm not always physically there. So I like doing my own things, and I think I found recently that's more about, you know, the creativity perspective. I just feel a lot more creative out and about with different people.
Sure.
And in different environments.
Changing tack slightly, what's your favourite song and why?
Look, there's a few. Look, Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division is always one of my favourites, just because I loved the song for so long. And then when Control, the film, was released 2007, I think it was, you actually went through the depth of what the song meant, and it was actually about depression and some really deep things, but it sort of showed that, you know, there can be messages, but they can have different sort of personal outcomes. For me, that's always a radiant song, just because, you know, the music's incredible, but then you learn the background, there's a bit more depth to it, and it sort of teaches you a bit more about freedom of expression. Look, there are other songs. For some reason, I'm a massive Beatles fan, but my favourite song is I Should Have Known Better, which is off A Hard Day's Night. If you watch the film, they're in the train with a harmonica, and it just sort of resembled a time of joy. And it was about my early discovery of the Beatles was when I was about 16 or 17, and you get into the first few albums, Please Please Me, with the Beatles, and so on. So it's sort of, that song encapsulated me learning more about something which has become a lifelong passion. So I always go back to that song. It's not their greatest song, but for me, it's always one of my favourites.
Well, and I think so much about music is what you were doing when you first heard it, you know, which is why I remember reading a great article about people particularly being wed often to songs that were new, or, but, you know, on the radio when they were at high school, because, you know, there's a fair bit of nostalgia looking back at those times. You know, you were young, anything was possible, you had your whole life ahead of you. I think that's as important or as significant as whether or not it's the greatest piece of music, even by any one particular artist. Andy, if you could invite 3 guests to dinner, living or not, who would they be?
Oh, look, that's always a challenging one. Look, I really love Ricky Gervais. I don't know if he'd be the greatest dinner party guest, depending on who the other people are. Yeah. But look, I just love Ricky Gervais. He's incredible. Look, John Lennon was someone, going off the Beatles sort of background, someone that I've always just loved, just because he was his own person. I think if you are a little bit of an outspoken person, like I tend to be, you sort of look to him, because he was not only outspoken about his own views that impacted his world, he seemed to have really clear thoughts on the broader world, all this peace movement and the like, which was really well ahead of his time, but it was very different. I mean, most of the people that were speaking up in that regard were usually political leaders, not so much musicians who had some real depth and clarity about what they were talking about. So he was always an extremely interesting character. And at the same time, for some reason, I've got a bit of a fascination with Yoko as well. I wouldn't mind if she was there as well.
Yoko as well.
I don't know if we'd work really well together as a quartet, Ricky Gervais, John Lennon and Yoko, but there's some fascination, and look,
some good characters there.
Yeah, look, and I don't mean to be discriminatory to Australians or Americans, but I've probably, through music and entertainment, more played to the British side of things. So a lot of my sort of influences, whether it be Joy Division, the Beatles or the like, are a lot more British focused.
Sure. Yeah, that's
apologies to any American listeners.
What would you say is the best piece of business advice you've ever been given, Andy?
I've got, look, it was actually from a very good friend's dad, and my father passed away 26 years ago, so it wasn't so much business advice, but it was soon after he passed away. He just said, remember, Andy, the good times never last, but at the same time, the bad times never last. So I think it's been more that focus that whenever you're feeling down, you know the wheel's going to turn.
Yes.
Whether it's business or personal. So that has always stuck with me, because it came at a critical time where anything else could have been said.
Sure.
Like, you know, bad luck, you know, sympathies or whatever. But it was just a really poignant, phrase from someone who I really respect and always had from the start. So, yeah, so that sort of always rings true, and you always bring it up every year or two. Yeah. When you're just like, oh, seriously. So it does, because look, I am one. that if I do get annoyed, I like to close the room and swear a fair bit, and internally.
I can relate to that.
Generally at other people. So that sort of allows me to stop and
Yeah.
put things in perspective.
I think that's an awesome piece of advice. It's also making me a bit teary thinking about the way in which that was delivered, but it's good. Andy, as we come to a close, is there any other career advice that you'd like to share with listeners?
Look, without being cliched, you know, the two words that I sort of come back to, and I was speaking to students the other week at Melbourne Uni, it's all about, and it sounds cliched, it's just about being authentic, being who you are. Because you do get to a stage, I think generally post 40, where a lot of the time you really couldn't give a stuff what people think. But you've got to be happy with yourself, because a lot of the time, a lot of other people don't really give a stuff either.
Yeah.
So it's about being authentic, and look, it gets used a lot, but about vulnerability. People actually bond with you if you do show that things are not always rosy. It doesn't mean that you make stuff up, but look, today it's been fantastic talking, because I don't feel like I've got to put up any guards as to a message that you're trying to convey. And I think the more you do that, you just speak more naturally. And people, I found recently a few presentations, people have been really complimentary and saying, wow, that was great, you really speak from your heart. And it was like, well, yeah, I was. And I said, well, that was a really well prepared speech. And I've found now I generally don't prepare speeches as much, so that you can get a feel for the room and the people you're speaking to. Sure, there are certain messages you've got to get through, particularly if you are there, whether it's media or you're presenting something where you've got direct points to get across. But I think that vulnerability, and maybe that's the wrong word, but just being honest to who you are and about the ups and downs, I think most people really connect with.
I would agree with that, and I feel that, so I'm a little bit younger than you, but only a couple of years.
You look much, much younger.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that's why we're doing podcasts, not video. But that really resonates with me, and I have often reflected on whether it's that I'm getting older, that I have more career experience, you know, more self-confidence, and perhaps it's a combination of all of them. But I find the more authentic that I am, the better relationships and the deeper relationships that that I develop or cultivate, and also the more fun I have at work, because you know what excites me is doing new, untested, uncharted stuff. And you know that varies depending on what kind of area I'm focusing on, but when I've taken the time to sit down and just say there's a real problem, or I have a real problem with X, thinking really creatively about how said problem can be solved, has provided a huge amount of fun for me at work, and a huge amount of value, and ultimately phenomenal relationships with people around me, because they can see my absolute passion and gusto, and just how driven I am by doing new, uncharted stuff. That's very good English. But that's when I am absolutely at my best, and that's that can only but make for strengthening relationships with people.
Yeah. And how have you found the corporate world has responded to that? Because look, you're a successful young businesswoman, mother, the like, who and knowing you a bit, you do have your own gusto.
Yeah.
In large corporates, how have you found people in terms of being receptive? I mean, the obvious answer is they should be hugely receptive, but when there are a lot of white middle-aged males like myself about there, they're not always as open.
On the whole, incredibly receptive. Upon occasion, I think my energy levels can probably be perceived as, or some people might find it a bit overwhelming at times. So I think, having worked in the corporate world for a long time, I'm a bit good at being a chameleon and flexing to different styles. In my true form, I am fairly loud. I am an extrovert. I am very high energy, but I work hard to some extent to mirror who I am in a room with. So, sometimes that's me at full energy, but with other people in other situations are much more calm, composed. I mean, I'd like to say I'm always composed, but a calmer, perhaps more serious, less energetic person is what's appropriate. So I think I've developed some good skills at flexing that accordingly on the whole.
It's hard when you're high energy. It's usually a very good thing.
It is. But
it is hard to sit still, and it's hard for others to...
yes.
And hard for yourself at times to fit within different circumstances. And you have to be very chameleon-like.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. My previous role, I worked with a firm of patent attorneys and people who all had PhDs in science and then a Masters of Intellectual Property. So brilliant academics. But they certainly had less energy than I did, and I really needed to just, tamp down my energy levels because once or twice I just sort of thought, this is, me at full energy is not the way to get the best out of this working relationship. So need to mix it up a bit. Well, Andy, thanks so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it today. I think I've really appreciated your honesty and vulnerability in sharing some of your life lessons, and I know that listeners will enjoy that too.
Great, thanks Katie. Thanks for the invite. It's been fantastic talking.
It's been good fun, thank you. And thanks for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, please review me on iTunes to help others find this awesome content. I have some great thought leaders coming up in the series. Subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode. And I love feedback from listeners. You can find me at Katie B Marketing on Twitter or Katie Bennett-Stenton on LinkedIn.